Thanks for making the efforts to come here tonight in the crisp, this is the height of winter, isn't it? But it's good to gather together and think about this important topic. Andrew Judd from Ridley College is here with us tonight for our QBF, and also realise this is our first QBF without Wayne Schuller. I think this is Wayne's sort of baby that he kicked off at back, so it's kind of living on now beyond Wayne. This is his legacy, us here tonight for a night of training and thinking about deep issues, and we're going to be doing that tonight. And I'm going to hand over to Andy pretty soon, but I first just wanted to paint a bit of the picture of why it's important to look at this topic. I know each Sunday I've tried to be explaining to you all that this is a really serious issue in our area, and just to highlight that further for you, I just wanted to show you some statistics which you can get online. These are statistics that the police and government areas collect. So I'm not sure if you know this, but in the city of Casey alone, that's our area, 15 family incidents are dealt with every day by Victoria Police. Family incidents are domestic violence issues, is what that is talking about. And that equates to 5,487 incidents per year. That's in Casey alone. How does that compare to the rest of the state of Victoria? Well, here are some statistics. These are, this amount of people per 100,000 are suffering from some kind of family violence incident. And so you can see there how the statistics have changed over the years, and the pandemic has certainly affected this. But yeah, the first column there, you can see the city of Casey currently, in last year, had 1,481 cases per 100,000 people. And that had gone up from the previous year. It's gone up in most places. Cardinia went down, thankfully. But you can see Dandenong, Cardinia, it's still a significant issue, and you can see the average in Victoria is 1,399, which is a great problem for us. That something that we as Christians should be concerned about, and particularly in our area, Casey, be concerned about. I'm not sure if it's still the case, but for a number of years, the city of Casey was the highest, had the highest issues, highest rate of domestic violence, of family violence in the state. The city of Casey has a program trying to tackle this issue, and the numbers did come down, but I think they hit a low in about 2017, and then they've gone back up. Obviously, the pandemic's had something to play into that. So it's a serious issue in our area. What can it look like? Well, here's another little chart just to show you some of the most frequently recorded types of abuse or violence. This is, if something happens and someone goes and tells someone about it, you've got to remember that that's not always the case. But here is what they report as what has happened. And you can see most of those issues are around sort of, verbal, emotional abuse are higher. And then the things you see, I suppose, physically, or that you're actually about to see after effects of physical abuse, property damage and threats are lower. But there's a significant amount of things that are going on before something you might see. Tonight's talk could be confronting, and you might come away wondering, where do we go from here, and what do I do, and who do I call on if I, recognise something happening like this. So we'll flag that a few times through the night, but just to flag at the start, if you notice some kind of family violence, here are some things, or if or if you're in that situation, here are some places to go. The first is you could contact a group called Ways. They're specifically there to help people in this situation, and they know it well. And so there's some contact details for them. Safe Steps is also another place you could go to. They're a 24/7, so 24 hours a day, 7 hours a week. They're a response centre, and you could call them and get advice, or call them if you're in danger or need to talk. And there's websites there for those as well. The state government put together this centre called Orange Door, which does help you to work out who you to talk to. So it's got a whole list of places that you can then go and directs you to different places to talk to. And they also have some drop-in, walk-in centres, and there is one in our area, and you can go to their website and find out the location of that. And there's a men's line as well for men. Most of the other websites are thinking about women, but there's men's line that men can talk to in 24/7 and have a chat about issues that might be going on. But of course, if someone comes to you and ever says something is happening and they're in danger, the first thing to do is call 000 and to talk to the police and make sure that person is safe or you are safe. That's the most important thing. And the police in our area are really good at talking through these issues. I've talked with them at times, and they're so familiar that they are a really great resource to talk to, and they'll know what to tell you and where to go through from there. So I really commend, if you're just seeking advice, don't call 000 because they've got other things. But if you're seeking advice, you could call the local police department, and they'll be able to help you and have some really helpful things for you to look out for. So I commend that to you. So I hope you see that this is an important issue for us in our area specifically, but as Christians it's an important issue because we care about people's well-being as people made by God and loved by God. And Andrew's going to unpack a bit more of this for us. So let me introduce Andrew, and then I'll get you to come up and share for us what you've prepared. But I'll just introduce, so Andrew, I've known Andrew for a while because I was at Ridley during part of his time. Andrew is a member and faculty at Ridley. He teaches in Old Testament, and he's also an ordained Anglican priest serving at City on a Hill, Melbourne. He's married to Steph, who's also an Anglican priest and serves at City on a Hill, Melbourne. And he's passionate, I found this out from Ridley, the website, passionate about helping people grow confident handling the whole Bible as God's message to us, which I can say that's true from my time of seeing you, Andy. But also in terms of this particular topic, I believe this is correct. I've been telling everyone, so I hope it is. You've contributed to the Ridley Online Certificate on this matter, and you've also written about violence in terms of Old Testament violence before, and thought deeply about how Christians engage with that material as well. So Andy, suffice it to say, Andrew has thought about this topic, and I think we'll have some valuable things for us to think about. So Andrew, I'll welcome you up, and as you come, why don't I open in prayer? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can gather on this rather chilly night, but this night that we can gather to grow in our compassion and care as Christians and grow to understand your word better and how we might love and serve our neighbours. We do pray, Lord, that you would give us wisdom as we hear and think about these things and help us to come away from tonight with some clear understandings of how we might be used by you to serve others and care for others. I pray for Andy now that you would give him clarity of speech as he explains these things. And Lord, in all of this, help us to lean on you and cry out to you with those concerns of our hearts. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you so much for that welcome, and thank you for having me back. I was actually scheduled to come a little while ago, but I accidentally got COVID, and I can assure you that spending time with you was much preferable at that point, but that was not an option. So thank you, and thank you also for, I guess, coming out in the cold for what is, I think, one of the most significant issues confronting us as a society, and as a church, and as families, and as people. So thank you for committing that time to working out how we as Christians, as church communities, can respond to domestic and family violence. It's worth just echoing, as Sam said, the material that we are looking at tonight obviously is some of the worst. I think it's important. I think it's good for us to talk about. But in a room like this, we're going to have different responses to this. For some of us, this might all be new and quite confronting. For others of this might be quite personally a difficult topic because of your own experiences or the experience of others in your life who you care about. If this gets too much, I really do encourage you just to go for a walk outside. No one will probably notice. I won't mind. And just look after yourself in this topic. And if you need a breather, that's totally fine. Sometimes I do as well. So what we're going to do, I'm going to start by looking at the Bible, an Old Testament passage, which for me is an important one for me, thinking through why, or I guess how God thinks about domestic and family violence, what God's perspective is on it. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk a little bit about I've got a test for you, just to liven things up, just to share our. Don't worry, it's not a hard one. It's more of a discussion to answer some questions, to think about some questions. And really the big takeaway tonight, I'm not going to try to make us all experts in responding to domestic and family violence, but I will put in a big plug for you to at least take the first step towards being better equipped by enrolling in the Ridley Certificate Unit. It's free. It's something you can do from the privacy of your own home if you've got internet there. It's very easy to do, and I think it's extremely helpful. I was involved in putting it together and getting funding for that, and we brought in a real expert in church response to this issue, Erica Hammonds, who's a dear friend but also a fine Bible teacher. I can't commend it highly enough, and did I mention it's free? Right? So there's no excuses, and my vision actually would be for everybody in any form of leadership, particularly whether you're leading a small group, or even if you just are a member, not just, if you're a member of the church, because my experience is this comes up, and we want to know how we can respond when it comes up in our church. I'm going to take you to one of the most awful passages in the Bible, and it's a passage in Judges chapter 19. I'm not going to read it all, but I'll tell you the story, and then I'll read the last verse of the chapter. The story goes like this. I know you did Judges a couple of years ago, but that was during lockdown, so we might not remember it. So the story is this. A young woman is married to a Levite man, leaves her husband. Now, we're not told why she leaves. We're not told the circumstances in which she left. But she leaves and she goes back to her family home, which is interesting in that culture because for her to leave her husband, particularly if there's been, social shame on her in that, it's very unusual for the father to welcome her in. So the fact that he does welcome her in suggests that he's sympathetic to her situation in her leaving her husband. So she goes back to her dad, and after a long time, actually, her husband decides to go after her. And he goes and he sits down. Interestingly, he has a great chinwag over a couple of days with her father, eating and drinking. She's not involved in that, as far as we see. They're eating, they're drinking, but she's not involved. And he goes with the intention of speaking to her heart. Right? He has a kind message, maybe a message of reconciliation. And she, or maybe the father, someone decides that yes, she will go back with him. And so far, so good. It seems like a happy story of reconciliation, for forgiveness. But there's actually a dark undercurrent to all this. And we start to get a hint of that as we go through the story, particularly the fact that she's not really given any active role in this discussion. The men decide, the men talk, and she leaves. On the way back, they kind of leave in a bit of a poorly planned departure. They leave with not enough time to get back to their home in Ephraim, which is sort of in the north above Jerusalem. And I mean, nightfall is fairly predictable, so it's not a very smart thing to leave in advance, particularly in that world, because they'll be travelling through hostile or at least foreign territory. Right? They're travelling through towns which are not their own Jewish people. Anyway, the servant who's travelling with them, the boy says, let's just stop here. It's getting dark and it's getting dangerous for travellers. But the Levite, the man, the husband, is determined that they're going to get back to Jewish town. They're going to get back to God's people, presumably because he thinks they're going to get a better treatment there. Anyway, as it turns out, that's not the case. They come to a town, and it's allegedly meant to be God's people living there, but they're not very welcoming, they're not very hospitable. And the men of the town surround the house after dark and demand that the house owner give up the Levite, the husband, to them for them to abuse him. At that point, something weird happens. Something horrendous, I should say, happens. And the husband, the one who's meant to be defending and protecting his wife, actually pushes her out into the mob. She is abused all night. And at daybreak, he comes out of the house and says to her quite gruffly, "Come on, get up." She doesn't move. He puts her on his donkey, and we're not told if she's alive or dead at that stage. He takes her, and at some point he takes a knife to her body and mutilates her corpse. We're not actually told by the text if she's dead at that point, so there is every possibility that he has killed his wife. Either way, this woman has suffered terribly. And it seems that no one is going to be brought to justice at this point. Because while the mob outside the house who abused the woman is awful, what I think is the most stinging betrayal in this story is that the man, the husband who was meant to be protecting her, ended up being the one who gave her over and abused her by casting her out of the house and potentially killed her, we're not sure. So what does the biblical text say about this? Well, there's not a lot of commentary all the way in. But in the book of Judges, the treatment of women is the barometer for the spiritual state of the nation. What I mean by that is, as the nation gets more and more ungodly, we see women are treated worse and worse. You want to know how spiritually a community is doing? According to the book of Judges, you need to look at how the women are being treated. God sees what's going on in this passage, and he does not approve. That's clear. In fact, the end of the passage is some bystanders who've kind of seen what's happened speak up, and they say this: "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt." This is verse 30. Just imagine. We must do something. Speak up. So what's the call on those standing by when something this horrendous happens? Well, we must do something. We must speak up. It's as if the outrage that this story elicits is one that we are meant to feel as readers, and I think that expresses something of how God feels about this type of thing, this mistreatment of the vulnerable in this society is an indictment of the community. Now, in the end, actually, they don't respond well to this. They see this violence and they commit more violence. Things spiral out of control. And so I think there's a subtle call on all of us as we witness violence, as we come to learn that there is violence. God knows what's going on behind closed doors, but we don't always. But when we become aware, when disclosures come to us, when people express what's going on in their lives, how are we going to respond in a constructive and helpful way? Because I think God wants us to respond well and helpfully to people when they come to us with their suffering. Let's just be very clear about one thing before we get into some of the practical. There is nothing in the Bible that ever expresses approval or even indifference to domestic or family violence. God is against abusers. And anyone who ever tries to use the Bible to justify their abuse is adding to their sin of abusing the sin of twisting God's words. And that's not a light thing. So let's be very clear. God is against domestic and family violence. And he sees what's going on and he is not for it. In fact, he is dead against it. So how can we be a helpful church, a helpful community in responding to it? Well, the first thing is just to understand a bit about the problem, to understand a little bit about what it is that we're talking about. I've got a couple of questions which hopefully I'll bring up. Now, these are taken from the quiz at the end of the first week of the Ridley Certificate Domestic and Family Violence unit. We're not covering the whole unit in this night or even 10% of the first week, but I just thought I'd give you a taste for some of the questions that, having completed the unit, you'll be able to answer in the final quiz. It's very easy. It's a multiple choice quiz, so don't worry. It's not. The goal is to learn, not to focus on the assessment. But the first question, and I'll actually ask you just to maybe think for a few seconds, and then if you're happy to share your response, I'd love to hear. I'd love for this to be two ways as well. So what do we mean when we talk about domestic and family violence? What do you think of when, what is it? So have a couple of seconds to think, and then I'll just get a few people, if you're happy, to inform us. All right, shoot up your hand. Any idea? How do we define domestic and family violence? Yeah.
It's when there's a person or people in the family who are being abused. So it may be verbally, where they're put down all the time, they're sworn at, they're told they're no good. It could be emotional, blackmail type thing. You know, if you go and see those people, I'm going to do this. It can be physical, where you hit, and often it's where it won't show. You know, the bruises or marks. It can be financial, where the person's completely controlling, they have complete control of the money. It's really where someone is just usurping their power totally over someone else, and their self-esteem just gets lower and lower and lower. And they've often, in that situation, the person doing it at first says they're sorry, they'll never do it again. And then there's a honeymoon period, but then it happens again. And the person it's happening to believes them at first and thinks they can change, and it can take a long time before they realise it's never going to change. And by then, they've got no self-esteem left, and it can be really hard to leave.
So many helpful things. Thank you so much in that response. If I can pick out a few things I think are really helpful. You've mentioned that it's not just physical, and I think that's extremely helpful for us to understand. There's a variety of tactics which abusers use. Physical is the most obvious one. It's what we think of when we hear police reports about domestic and family violence. But it's not the only tactic. And they are just tactics towards a goal, and whatever tactics work. And in a church context, spiritual abuse would be another one we could add into that, the use of biblical texts to achieve that end. So what are all those tactics trying to achieve? Well, you mentioned that as well, really helpfully. It's about power over another person. So at the heart of domestic and family violence is a person using whatever tactics are available, whether it's physical, words, emotion, spiritual text, whatever it is, to control another person. And that's what is, I guess, at the heart of all the different types of abuse that we see. The other thing just to mention, which you also helpfully mentioned, it's not just between husbands and wives. It's also between children and parents. So a lot of domestic violence, family violence, can actually be children and their parents, maybe their older parents, or maybe the other way around. It can be caregivers, paid caregivers, unpaid caregivers, who are looking after someone who's vulnerable. It can be anyone, right? But these are particularly family violence. In Victoria, under the Family Violence Protection Act, it's defined as a spouse or de facto partner, an ex-partner, that's really important, an ex-intimate partner. It doesn't have to be a current relationship. Children, siblings, parents, grandparents, caregivers, relatives, and within some traditional societies, kinship, kind of broader kinship structures. So we want to see it broadly, because otherwise we might miss or not understand different types of violence. So thank you so much. You've picked out all the things that we need to know there. The second question, what percentage of women have experienced physical violence, a particular type of domestic and family violence, from a current or former partner? Any guesses? What percentage of women in Australia's society in general have experienced violence, physical violence, from an intimate partner since they were 15 years old?
I think it'd be a lot higher than a lot of people probably expect. I'll say 70%.
70%?
Yep.
It's actually 23%, according. But let's just be clear. That's chronically underreported. So you may well be right, because this is talking about physical violence. There's lots of other types of violence, but about a quarter is the general stat for the Australian population. Proviso being, this is very underreported because people don't always talk about it. It's not always safe to talk about it. Here's an interesting one. During separation, so someone leaving their partner, does that usually make them safer, less safe, or about the same? I'll get a hand at the...
When a person makes a decision to leave, there is an increased risk to them, particularly women who take the step to leave the relationship, then there's an increased risk to their safety and the safety of any children that are with them. So.
Yeah, thank you. That's absolutely right. So when a separation occurs, for whatever reason, the risk of violence increases for most people experiencing violence. And that's an important thing for us to realise, because an attitude that we often hear in society is, why doesn't she just leave? And the answer to that can be, because it's not safe to. And so as people who are responding, our natural and good inclination might be to try to do something. But in doing something, we can actually make things much, much less safe. Okay, so all this is just to say, that's why we need to be trained in how to respond, so we don't do something that's actually going to adversely affect the situation of the person experiencing violence. Right? The person experiencing violence, she or he knows how to manage their situation, their daily risk better than we do. And so unless there's as Sam mentioned, unless there's an instantaneous kind of threat to someone's health and you need to call the police, normally it's not your job or my job to do something. That's not up to us. And so that's very important for us to realise and not do unhelpful things and make things less safe. Fourth question and final question. Is domestic and family violence more prevalent in the church or less prevalent in the church than in broader Australian society? What do you think? Is it more prevalent or less prevalent? Anyone? Anyone willing to take a guess?
I think it's more, and in the Anglican Church, it's more.
Okay. So probably about the same or higher in the church. Okay? So probably about the same or higher. We'll get to that in a second when we look at some of the stats, which is alarming, isn't it? Now, we can get to the stats and unpack some of that in a second, but the research we have suggests it's the same or higher in the church as in Australian society as a whole, which means this is not a problem out there, it's a problem in every church, in every community. On that, let's have a look at some stats. So as I mentioned, see on the screen there, 1 in 4, or 23% of women have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner since the age of 15. That's intimate partner violence, that's not including other family members, that's not including other types of abuse, that's just a stat. Out of interest, that percentage for men is about 8%. So it is a gendered problem, though I stress there are male victims or male survivors of domestic violence as well, but it is more common for the person experiencing violence to be a woman. People, particularly with a disability or Aboriginal heritage, are much more likely to experience violence too. So that's a risk factor that's worth being aware of. The other thing is that children experience intimate partner violence. That's worth knowing as well. 13% of women and 10% of men have witnessed violence as a child. And witnessing violence is a type of violence because it profoundly and traumatically affects children and they grow up into adults. So 30% of women have experienced violence towards their mother. And in terms of crime statistics, Sam showed us some of that before, but if you're looking at domestic and family violence-related homicides, which is a pretty gruesome stat, 86 women and 59 men were killed by a current or former or someone in their family in 2020. Okay, so that's 86 women and 59 men were killed in a domestic or family violence-related incident in 2020. About 40% of all homicides are domestic or family violence-related. So it's a huge problem across the country. And it was helpful, Sam mentioned this as well, during COVID there was a massive uptick for a variety of reasons in the stats. In terms of the church itself, this is helpful for us to know, looking around a room, say of 100 people, how many people within that room, hang on, just going to go that one, how many people in that room have experienced violence. This is something, when I'm training preachers, I try to get into them. Right? When you look at a room of 100 people that you're preaching to, it's not theoretical that there are people who have even recently experienced violence or in their lifetime. So the National Anglican Family Violence Project did commission some research by some demographers to look at the prevalence of domestic and family violence in Australian churches and in the broader community. And what they found is if you ask Australian Anglicans, have you experienced domestic or intimate partner violence in the last 12 months, it's about the same as the rest of the society, the rest of the Australian population. About 17% have experienced it in the last year. So if you've got a group of 100 people in your church, 17 of them have experienced violence in the last 12 months. That is a shocking thing to realise. And that's within Australian Anglican churches. Now, the study didn't go into why that is the case, whether the perpetrator is a member of the church or not. That's not part of the study. But we do know that those people experiencing violence are part of our church communities. And so we need to be aware, and we need to be prepared, I guess, to be a positive and not an unhelpful part of their life. When you ask about the experience over an entire lifetime, that's when the headline stat you might have seen in the media, that's where this stat came in. So if you ask about their lifetime, about 44% of Anglicans have experienced intimate partner violence. So you're not asking about the 12 months previous, you're asking about have you ever experienced it. That's higher, slightly higher than the rest of the population at 44% compared to 38% of the general Australian population. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why that could be the case, but the aim of the study was to work out, is this a problem for people who go to our churches? And the answer is a resounding yes. Okay, so this is why I'm glad you're here, and I'm preaching to the choir, right? Because you're here learning and wanting to learn about it, which is excellent. And that was the case across all the different types of violence: physical, sexual, spiritual abuse, using the Bible to try to control somebody, and other types of harassment. Now, I'll just pause on that for a second to note a couple of things. If you, and I'm talking to you now, this is not theoretical, if you are in danger, please do, immediate danger, please do call the police or an ambulance. Right? We want everyone to be safe. And if this has brought up something for you that you want to talk about, there's a lot of different numbers you can use. I've got a couple there. One is 1-800-RESPECT, which I kind of keep somewhere handy. That's available 24/7 for information. And you can call that if you are experiencing it and you want kind of confidential counselling, but also if you just want to get information about how to help somebody confidentially, you can call that. It can be a bit confronting when you have all these numbers and all these services. There's no wrong number to call. Okay, let's just be clear about that. So if you call the wrong service, they can get you to the right place. Okay, so don't stress too much about the right number, but 1-800-RESPECT is a good place to start. And Anglicare Victoria also can provide counselling for you, because as you hear people talk to you about their experience, or maybe you've experienced something, you might want to talk through that with somebody yourself to to process that. Likewise, Anglicare also provides counselling for men who want to take responsibility for their own violence. So that's a possibility too, if that's you or somebody you are thinking of. So the reason I'm really passionate about this is a bunch of things. I think everyone should be interested and passionate about this, but I think particularly as Bible teachers, we have a responsibility to make sure that the church is a positive part of the lives of people experiencing violence. And it can be. So the research I mentioned earlier did point to the fact that spiritual texts, the Bible, can be used by abusers to control people. And some of the messages and theologies that we hear preached can be unhelpful. So if I preach on the necessity of forgiveness, survivors tell us that that can be really unhelpful if I don't also note that forgiveness doesn't mean you trust somebody if it's not safe to do so. So we need to take responsibility for the way our words actually can negatively impact someone, but also the research told us that our words in church, in small groups, over morning tea, not just up front, but in our community, can actually be profoundly healing, can be a positive, restorative part of people's lives. In fact, I know of domestic abuse survivors or people who've experienced it who actually come to church because that community has enabled them to have the strength to get out of that situation. So we can be a real force for good as a community, or we can be careless and damaging as a community. And so the reason why I'm really passionate about this is I think we can do some good, not just be kind of co-opted by abusers to continue their abuse. The final thing just to say before I open up for any questions you might have, I'm happy to field questions. This is not your training. This is what I've just done now, is not your training on responding to domestic and family violence. Right? This is the invitation to take some training. And one of the great ways you can do that is actually the certificate course, which I've mentioned maybe 5 times so far. I really want you to do it. It's free, it's video-based, with some great resources there, so you can go deep into it if you want, or you can just watch the videos and get a general sense of how, what violence is, how it exhibits itself in a church context, how different parts of the Bible can be helpful or unhelpful in how they're taught. And then really a big focus is responding. When someone discloses abuse, in that conversation, how do you respond? What do you say? What don't you say? And how can you be a helpful person in their life? Because chances are, if it hasn't already happened to you, you will have a disclosure of abuse at some point in your life. And you want to be good. You want to be helpful. You don't want to make it worse. And that's why I commend this course to you. So I think at that point, well, I've got some discussion questions if you don't have any questions. Or, you know, I think Sam can come around with the microphone and we can talk about this together. But
Yes, so I have a microphone and just ask you to keep your question as succinct as you can so that and you can remember it to answer it and try and go one at a time. So one question and then give someone else a shot. I see Russell's got a question.